No. So we go to the second historical sequence concerning all these problems. We can define the second sequence, second moment, as a fusion of the one and the infinite. Under the name of God. God is the name during all this sequence of that sort of transcendent fusion of the one and of the infinite. With some immediate abstract consequences before the historical examination. There is abstract consequences which we can now perfectly understand. If there is a fusion between the one and the infinite, there's a new idea of God. We have also a fusion of the idea of the infinite and the classical idea of perfection. The classical idea of perfection is a complete identity between existence and being. All possibilities of being are realized in existence. If, under the name of the one is the name of that sort of perfection, which is the realization of, a complete realization of being, of potentialities of being by existence. If the one is the same thing as the infinite, we can say that we have that sort of perfection, but at an infinite level. At the infinite level, at the level of God, we have the complete realization of being as a form of existence. Abstract consequences. But it's being itself which is infinite. The being of God, which is infinite. So, the existence of God is the existence of an infinite being. So, the existence of infinite possibilities. So, God is the realization of infinite possibilities, naturally. And so the very concept of God is that for God, there is no distinction between the possible and the real at the infinite level. There is infinite possibilities, but all these possibilities exist because the perfection, the classical perfection of God. The second sequence is also something of the first sequence. The definition of perfection as a complete identity between being and existence. But if being is infinite, we have some consequences because there is infinite possibilities, there is an infinite number of possibilities, and so God is the realization of something infinite. And so all what exists is in the dependency of God. There cannot be something which is outside the infinite possibilities, what is the being of God. And it is why we have in the second sequence the completely new idea that God creates the world and finally creates all what exists. All what exists are realization of the being of God in some sense, as infinite being of possibilities. Okay? So it's the second great genealogy of the second sequence, which is the idea of God, which first is also the one, and after that is the God who creates all what exists. It was not at all a Greek idea. In the Greek culture, we have not the idea of a God who creates the world. It's an idea of Judaism, naturally. So it's not a Greek origin, it's the Jewish origin. You know? This idea of a God who creates the world. And so we can say that the second sequence is abstractly the fusion of the one and the infinite, but historically is the creation of a fusion between something Greek and something Jewish. That is, finally, the birth of what we name today the Western world. The Western world, at the very beginning, is certainly an operation of fusion of something Jewish and something Greek, because of the fact that if the infinite is in relationship to being, the perfection of the one is the realization of not only some possibilities, but infinite possibilities. And so, infinite possibilities is really the conception of possibilities without limit. We return to apeiron. But possibilities without limit signify that all possibilities are included in the potential of God. And so God creates, realized all what exists. And much more, all what can exist. All that is perfectly unified, perfectly consistent vision, historically. Alors, so, under the name of God, we have, during this sequence, the incorporation of the infinite to the one, so a complete change, because the perfection is not at all to be inside the limit, but really to have no limit. It is a fundamental change, you understand that? If the one is the same thing that the infinite, we have infinity of possibilities. The realization of the infinity of possibilities is something which is without limit, and so we have the absolute potency of God without limit and without hubris, naturally. Because if you have no limit, we cannot go beyond the limit. It's precisely what is absolutely impossible for God, to go beyond his proper limits. Because God has no limits at all, so he cannot go beyond limits. So God cannot be in the state of hubris. The new God. New God. And finally, the one change of nature. There is something like a fundamental change of the definition of the one. Certainly, the one is always the perfection in the sense of complete realization of possibilities of being in existence. But there is something new, which comes certainly directly from Judaism. In Judaism, before all that, you know, God is not only unified, not only one. All singularities are one, finally. But there is only one God. Monotheism. Monotheism. One God. And so one is a quality of God. Inside God we have a complete and perfect unity. So God is the one, in the Greek sense. But there is only one God. Another sense of the word one. If you want, God is immanently the one, by itself, by himself, by herself, as you want. It is one, but there is also one God in the numerical sense of the one. There is no other God. So we can say that God is the one, but also there is one God, and so finally God is the only one, properly. Because God is the one, the perfect one in the Greek sense, but there is only one God, so we can say that God is the one, the only one. It's twice one. And it is why God progressively is separated of the world. Greek gods exist inside the world. No, completely. We can see those when they. Maybe it's not a good thing to see him. We can. It's a possibility. And you know the Greek gods, for example, love human female very much, in fact. I think they prefer human female than goddess. It's a very complex question. But they are, in some sense, they are in the world. There is only one world, and inside this world there are also something like gods. It's not the case of the new God. And why? But because precisely we must affirm, because of the infinite, that the new God created the world. But we cannot create the world without being outside the world. So the new God is outside the world. It's a transcendent God. But the new problem is, what is the relationship between God and the world? God is the realization of the infinite in the form of the one. It's probably the abstract definition of the new God. The God is the realization of infinity in the form of the one. If God is something like that, God is outside the world, it's the creation of the world, and the world itself is finite, because it is precisely the creation of the infinite as such. So the world is the realm of finitude, and God is the realm of infinity at the end. Very clear. Vision, what we know, vision of the great monotheism of our world today too. So that is the situation, the new situation. In the second sequence, the question of infinity becomes finally the question of relationship between God and the world. God as the true realm of the infinite, the realm of infinity, and the world, and human beings in the world as realization of something which is infinitude. And you know why this problem is very difficult? Because there is no common measure between the infinity of God and the finitude of human life. I take human life because we are interested first by human life, after all. There is no common measure. And it was not, in the classical vision, we have not this problem. Because infinite is an abstraction. And the perfection is inside finitude. The norm of life is inside finitude. But in the second sequence, when we have a fusion between the one and the infinite, we have the multiplicity of finitude, and there is no common measure. So there is pure transcendency of God, you know. And in some sense, in regard to God, we are like nothing. Because the relationship between finite and the infinite is without common measure, and so finally is like the relationship between being and nothingness. It's a very great difficulty, and is precisely the fundamental difficulty of thinking, of philosophy, during all the second sequence. How to understand the relationship between transcendency of God and finitude of the creature if there is no common measure between the infinite and the finite. And there is no common measure, in fact. Why God is not completely indifferent to human being, for example, like something which is near nothing, absolutely near nothing, in comparison to its proper infinity. And so, the most important question of all the sequence can be named the question of mediation. Mediation between the finite and the infinite. What is the third term, if you want, the third term, which is between the transcendency of God and the finitude of the world, the third term, which is a mediation between the two, and which creates something like a possible common measure between the two. And I insist on the fact it's a new question. In the realm of finitude, we have no that sort of question because we have only the question of the realization of the possibility of being. I take an example of this absence of common measure. If God is infinite, we cannot know all the possibilities because all the possibilities are inside the infinite being of God. So God can naturally realize a possibility that we cannot know and we cannot understand. It's a logical necessity. It's not an invention of something. No, it's perfectly rational. Perfectly rational, I insist on this point. If we have something like a fusion between the one and the infinite, if the one is also on the side of the perfection of the realization of being by existence, and if the being so is infinite, we have an infinite possibilities concerning the existence of God. And so it's a question of miracle. Miracle is always the point where we have the realization by God of a new possibility that we cannot understand. And I insist on the fact that sometimes it is said that miracle is something irrational. But no, it's something irrational from the point of view of finitude only. Miracle is the existence of miracles is in fact purely a rational possibility. If God, the transcendency of God, is outside the realm of finitude, certainly God can create new possibilities. And so it's perfectly rational that we have miracles. Is Pascal insists on this point, that miracles are not at all irrational events, but that they are purely rational from the point of view of the existence of God. And what would be absolutely irrational is the complete absence of miracles. Because it would be a limitation of the potency of God. And so it would be a proof of the falsity of the fusion between the perfection of the one and the infinity of being. And we can say that miracle is a first form of mediation. Because miracle is something which happens in our world, but without any explanation which have come from this world. So, miracle is in some sense a proof, a rational proof of the existence of something transcendent, something which is outside the law of the world. And it is why Pascal writes, concerning the critic, the rational critic of miracles, that they are irrational, these critics. The rationality is on the side of miracles. If we have, naturally, something like the fusion of the one and the infinite. So, miracle is a mediation in this sense. With mediation, with a miracle, we have something which is between our world, finitude, rational laws of the world, and so on, and God at the realm of infinity. And the proof is that we cannot understand miracle. The proof, that the rational proof that God exists is precisely that we cannot understand miracle. If we can understand miracle, miracle is not a miracle. So if we can prove that exists something like a miracle, that is something which is a pure exception of the laws of the world, if something like a pure exception of the laws of the world exists, we have something like an access, a new mediation in the direction of the existence of the new God. The God which realizes the fusion between the one and the infinite. But naturally, the paradigm of the mediation is the figure of the Christ. Mediation has been something like a name for the Christ, the figure of Jesus, which is a great invention, after all, of Christianism. And why? Because this figure, the figure of the Christ, is precisely a mediation between the finite and the infinite. The first attempt to propose the real existence, the historical existence of a mediation. As you know, Jesus is God, the Christ is God, but he is God inside the finite form of human existence. Jesus is God inside the form of human existence, including suffering and death. So including the most significant forms of finitude, suffering and death. So the Christ, as such, is a common measure between infinite and finite. This common measure, which is precisely our problem, our problem of the second sequence. The sequence which is opened by the progressive fusion between the one and the infinite creates the problem. If there is no common measure, we cannot understand and we cannot have a relationship to God. And so we cannot have, finally, an real understanding of what exists. But with the Christ, we have a mediation, and we have a common measure. So we have an existence which is simultaneously infinite and finite. It is why we can speak of the second sequence as something like a Christian age, or age of Christianism. Not because only the domination of a religion and so on, but at a more abstract level, a more philosophical level, because it's clearly the proposition of a solution to the problem. It's really the affirmation of the existence of a mediation. And so it's the proposition of a possibility to maintain a relationship between human existence and the divine existence beyond the problem of the common measure between the two. Because we have really the existence of a common measure in the form of human existence, including suffering and death, which is simultaneously a part of the existence of God. It's not simple to understand, in fact. It's not simple to understand. The objection had always been that finally this solution is something like the problem itself. Because how we can understand that the human existence with suffering, death, and so on is, in fact, in its true being, something like the infinite God. But we can observe the success of this proposition. The historical success of this proposition during many centuries is not arbitrary. It was really a new proposition, a completely new proposition concerning the fundamental question of relationship between finite and infinite. And it was the solution of a mediation between the two, of a common measure between the two. It was simultaneously a complete separation, the creation of the world by God, the infinite existence of God, the infinite possibilities, miracles, and so on. And on the other side, we have a complete fusion between the two in pure subjectivity, the subjectivity of the Christ. So it was really a proposition of a new vision of all the construction of human destiny. And it is certainly why there has been a real success of this proposition, as, in some sense, a rational supposition. Naturally, it is why I've spoken of miracle. It's, in some sense, a miracle by itself. It is a man who is also a God. So something finite who is also something infinite. So it's the affirmation of the existence of mediation, of a common measure, and it's a miracle in some sense. But it's not completely an objection. Because naturally, if there is a common measure between the two, it must be from the point of view of God himself. And so it's by necessity a miracle. If we completely understand what is that sort of fusion between finite and infinite, it will be something which is inside the world. But it cannot be something inside the world, because it's precisely something which is not inside the world, between the relationship between the world and something which is outside the world. You know? So certainly it's a miracle, but to say that the existence of the Christ is a miracle is not a true objection against this existence. It's not completely a rational objection. And this is why, once more, says Pascal, naturally, the existence of the Christ is a miracle, because it's a creation by God of something which is inside the world and which is, in some sense, outside the world. So the mediation between something outside the world and inside the world is a miracle for us, but it's not by itself a miracle. What is rational is precisely that it is a miracle. And I tell you that without any faith. I say that from the philosophical point of view. We have to examine this sequence from the point of view of the strength of the sequence, and not to criticize the religion disposition. I agree with the fact that it's a very clear, in some sense, and very strong proposition to propose the form of subjectivity, of a human subjectivity, something which by itself is a common measure between the infinite and the finite. Now, this common measure between infinite and finite is also, we can say, a common measure between the one and the multiple. If the multiple is the existence, the finite existence. In some sense, it's also a common measure between true being and nothingness. The title of the great book of Sartre, Being and Nothingness. And the attempt to find a mediation between being and nothingness, precisely the goal of all the second sequence. Because the Christ, by himself, is in some sense a mediation between being and nothingness. The absolute being of God and the existence near nothingness of human beings. And we can name all that the dialectical thinking. The dialectical thinking. I think that at the philosophical level, the second sequence is the creation of dialectics. Dialectics, which is finally the thinking of mediation. The thinking of mediation between two contradictory terms. Very ordinary definition of dialectics, but we can read it here. In some sense, Christianism is the invention of dialectical thinking. That is its strength. That is a proposition of a new thinking in which we can find a term which is a mediation between two absolutely contradictory terms. So it's the theory of the third term. The term which is the mediation between the two contradictory terms. And we examine during finally all the week the contradictory terms in the form of infinite and finite. And certainly, Christianism is a dialectical proposition concerning this separation in the form of the Christ. And in dialectical thinking, we have always, elementary, we have always three terms at the end. We have three terms because we have the two contradictory terms and we have the mediation between the two. In Hegel, in the work of Hegel, which is a great dialectical philosopher, we can find we can find the idea that in fact we have finally four terms and not only three. That is, we have the two contradictory terms, we have the mediation, and we have the movement of the three terms. We have the process of the three terms and the result of the process, which is in some sense a fourth term. The dialectical thinking must be a movement. The mediation must be an active mediation. I understand the Christ is not only a third term. We have the action of the Christ, the words of the Christ, the death of the Christ, and so on. It's a process. It's a long, difficult, and terrible process. It's not to put a third term and the problem is closed. No. So it's the action of the third term, which is finally a sort of displacement of the two first terms. In the life of Christ, in the life and death of Christ, we have the movement by which something of the infinite goes inside the finite. Because the Christ is something like that. It's not only something which is finite and infinite. It's something which is the movement by which the infinite itself goes inside the finite. And this movement, which is the dialectical movement, is something like the result of all the process, and is not reducible to 1, 2, 3. We have 1, 2, 3, but we have the movement by which the third term displaces the two first in a new manner. In a new manner. This is why, after the Christ, the world is not the same. There is a change, because there has been a common measure between God and human beings. And as you know, the name of all that is that human beings are saved of their finitude, finally. They have a new access to the pure infinity of God by the sacrifice of the Christ. But this sacrifice is not a sacrifice. This sacrifice is a victory. The terrible death of the Christ is the victory of the Spirit, and so on. And so, all that is really the creation of dialectical thinking. And after that, we have different forms of the three terms. In Christianism as such, we have God, Jesus, and the salvation of humanity. So God, Jesus, and human beings. We have Father, Son, and Spirit. And the fourth at the end. And so the three terms are the movement of the three. We have in a more abstract level, which is our level here, we have the infinite, the mediation, and the finite. And so on, and so on. In Hegel, we have many forms of the dialectical rhythm of the thinking. But the general framework is abstraction, nature, and absolute. Abstraction, being as such, infinity as such, and so on. After that, we have existence, natural existence or historical existence of all that. And the third term is the absolute, which is simultaneously abstract and universal and natural or historical and concrete. So we have that Hegel names concrete universality, which is the result of the dialectical process, abstraction, nature, and absolute. We can say, to conclude the examination of this second sequence, that we have first the closed perfection of antiquity with sculpture and tragedy. And we have, after that, the mediation of Christianism, which gives us the absolute idea of dialectical thinking. And the other point is that inside dialectical thinking, we have the possibility to go beyond the limits. Why we have the possibility to go beyond the limits? Because we have an access to the realm of infinity. We are not absolutely closed in our finitude, because there is a mediation. There exists a third term. There exists a possible access to the realm of the infinite. First of all, at the beginning, by the figure of the Christ, but progressively, all that becomes a philosophical idea, not a religious one, but a metaphysical. The idea of Hegel and many others. The idea of the possibility for human being to open an access, a new access to the infinity or to the absolute. And with or without the figure of the Christ. Certainly, the figure of the Christ has been the first attempt to create something like that in the religious framework. But after that, we have, as always, a sort of philosophical emancipation of the religious framework and the abstract possibility to open an access for human beings to the infinity, and so the possibility to don't be closed in the finitude of being. And we can name this position Romanticism, after the classical determination. Romanticism is the idea that we can find an access of something which is outside the world. So we can organize, we can have the becoming inside the world of something which is outside the world. We can, in some sense, create a new Christ, a new mediation. We can create in the form of poetry, in the form of exceptional historical action, maybe in the form of political revolution. In all these forms, we can create something which is like a descent and access to infinite inside the finitude itself. And so, Romanticism, as the final result of the second sequence, is the reverse of classical position on one fundamental point, which is we can create new possibilities. It's a form of a new access to the infinite. And I think that if sculpture and tragedy was typically classical arts which are appropriate to the classical vision, we can say that poetry and music are appropriate to the second sequence. Poetry, because the romantic conception of the poem, is that by poetry we can create new possibilities of the language. We can not only use the language to name the things, to speak with others and so on, but inside the language, by poetic means, we can create really new possibilities. The language can be forced to say something which was before impossible to say. Poetry is a possibility to say what is impossible to say. So when you create the possibility of something impossible, you create naturally a new possibility. Because in the law of the world there is a clear distinction between what is possible and what is impossible. And poetry is the creation of something which was impossible. Something which is impossible to say, but with poetical means we can say something which is absolutely new, which was impossible to say before the poetical gesture itself. And it's sometimes the same thing in music. Music which is maybe the romantic art by excellence. Because in music too, we can create a sensible world, absolutely new. We can create new forms of sensibility. And in any case, we can find all that in Hegel, we can find all that in Schopenhauer for music, we can find for poetry and music in Nietzsche and so on. So the apology of all these arts can be found in philosophy. But the most important point maybe is that we can find something like that in politics too. In politics too. The idea that it's possible to create a completely new possibility in the field of politics. It's the idea of revolution. The typically romantic idea of revolution. And it's also a new access to infinity. The idea that the law of the world can be broken. The law of the world can be, we can go beyond the laws of the economic world, of the social world, of the hierarchical world, and so on. We can go beyond oppression and alienation and so on. But we can do that not by passion and not certain transformation, but we can do that by a real creation, a collective creation of something new. We can create a new humanity, in fact, a new humanity. Something which is a new representation of humanity by itself. So, in all the revolutionary ideology of the 19th century, because 19th century is a great romantic century. In all revolutionary vision, we can find the idea that the collectivity, the human beings being together, can create in historical becoming something as new as a new poem or a new artistic creation. It's really the idea. It is why there is something artistic or aesthetic in this vision, not only political, economical, and so on. The idea that the action, the historical action, can be and must be at the same level as artistic creation. That is, to create for the collectivity, by the means of collectivity itself, a new collective world. A new collective world. Which is something like an historical and political work of art. A work of politics. And it's not at all the realization of a new possibility. It's not something like we can do something better than the world as it is. Inside the world, we can do something which is better than the world as it is, and so on. And it's the idea that we can go in action from a completely different idea of what is human being as such. And this is why there is not only the idea of a new collective world, but the idea of new human beings. With the transformation of the world, we have the transformation of the subjectivities too. And you can say, okay, but what is, why all that with infinite and finite? Because that is the problem. If there is the possibility of creation, true creation of a new world, it's not by the realization of an objective possibility. It's by the creation of something in something from nothingness, something which does not exist, but must be and can be created by thinking and action. So it's not the consequences of the old world, it's really the birth of a new world. And the birth of a new world with new laws of the world itself. And with poetry, with music, with revolutionary thinking, we have a new, completely new conception of relationship between finite and the infinite, without the necessity of a religious framework, with or without. No, there is no contradiction between all that and the religious framework. But there is no obligation of the religious framework. At the beginning, we have something like that. But in the 19th century, we have sometimes poetry and revolutionary determination inside the religious framework. But we have also something like that outside the religious framework. So there is no necessity of this relationship, but there is, finally, a completely new vision of the relationship between the finite condition of action, the finite world and so on, and the infinite. And the mediation is new possibility. The creation not only of a new real, but of a new possibility, which was not perceived, which was not existent before. Something which is thinking action, decision, organization, movement, and so on. And there is also something like a mediation between the old world and the new world. And this mediation is always an event, something which happens without any possibility to calculate completely this happening. So it's possible to say that inside the Romanticism, which comes before the classical vision, we have by necessity something near a miracle. We have miracles in Christianism as such, naturally. But a revolutionary event is something like a rational miracle too, because it's also a mediation. It's also a mediation between the laws of the old world and the possibility of a new world. I insist on the point, the possibility, not the necessity of the new world, but the possibility, the creation of a new possibility. The event is not the creation of a new real, it's the creation of a new possibility, a new subjective possibility. It is why when we have an event as clear as all the movement in all the Arabic countries in the last months, nobody knows what is the destiny of all that. Nobody can say that it's no. It's the opening of new possibilities, new differences, new differences. And in this sense, it's a miracle, not, once more, because there is something irrational, something which we cannot understand at all, but only because it's something like a mediation between our finitude, our situation, the laws of the world, and a new possibility. Maybe the new possibility finally will be nothing. We must accept the failure of all that. Exactly like finally Christianism itself must accept the failure of the mediation after all. It's not true that everybody is saved. Not true. So we have a miracle with consequences, limited consequences. It's the same thing in the political vision, but it's really a new access to the infinity of the world as such. The world, inside the world, we have, by the mediation of some events, the birth of new possibilities, and these possibilities does not come from the being as such. They come from what in the being was not existent, was not possible. So I name all that a miracle because it's the sudden possibility of something which was objectively impossible. Absolutely impossible. Nobody was thinking that the complete change of the situation in Egypt was possible. We have read something like that somewhere? Absolutely. It was, on the contrary, a very strong situation. Mubarak was really a big chief. All that was absolutely consistent. And so the riot and so on in Egypt, and finally the complete fall of Mubarak. Well, what is all that? It's really a miracle. We must have the courage to name that a miracle. Not in an irrational religious sense. but in the sense that it's the birth of a new possibility, the opening of something, and not a consequence of the situation. After that, the historian writes that finally it's a consequence, and they find all causes and so on. But in the true life, in the existence, the collective existence of all men and women, we are doing all that. It's not a consequence. One day there is something like that. And so I don't think that all that is irrational. I think it's perfectly rational, but it's the rationality of the becoming of a new possibility. It's not the rationality of the pure consequences, determination of the situation as such. And so, to conclude on the second sequence, during all these times, which are between the second sequence and the third sequence, or in the consequences of the second sequence, but without the religious framework and so on, what I name, finally, Romanticism, to oppose Romanticism to classical vision. What we have is a completely new articulation between all our terms. Finally, we have much more something like that. The origin of the situation is the opposition between existence, which is in a framework which is finite, and being, which is without any visible determination. And so, what we have is event as a mediation. And event as a mediation creates the opening of new possibility, which after that open a new access to the infinite. So it's a complete transformation of the relationship between all the terms. Naturally, we are always the point of departure of relationship between existence and being, and we have the idea, the classical idea, that existence as such is finite. But we have the idea, which comes really from Christianism and the second sequence, that there is the possibility of mediation. So the mediation is something which is, and which is something like an interruption of the laws of the finite. Exactly like the Christ, after all. The Christ, what is the Christ? The Christ is something which is inside the finite, but which is a complete interruption of the laws of the finite. Because precisely, the Christ is infinite. So there is suffering, there is death, but there is resurrection. And resurrection is the fact, the miracle, the true miracle, where something completely new appears. Something which is the proof that we have a mediation between the finite and the infinite. In the event as mediation, but event can be a new poetry, can be a new work of art, the invention of a new music, not only maybe the invention of a new extraordinary scientific theory, a new mathematical invention, and so on. All that is in the field of the possibility of a new mediation, which creates a new possibility at the point of the impossible itself. Where something was impossible, we find a new possibility that is something which is, we extract from the impossible itself something like a new possibility. And this new possibility returns to the being by saying that we can do with our being, we cannot change, we can do something which was impossible to imagine. And it is the point of, the fundamental point of Romanticism. We can do something that we cannot do. We can do something which was impossible for us to do. And when we are inside a revolutionary movement, inside a new collective, when we have a new feeling concerning a new work of art, and so on, we are precisely in this position. We experiment in our proper lives that something is possible which was not possible. And this experiment is the birth of a new subject, that is a new relationship between existence and being. New relationship which is not a direct one, but the mediation of something new. By the mediation, we become a new subject. And maybe the most simple example is love, naturally. And it is why love is also something absolutely fundamental in Romanticism. Why is something fundamental? Because it's an example of, in some sense, a pure event. The encounter of somebody. The encounter of somebody without any preparation. There is the encounter, the absolutely contingent encounter with somebody, which is the mediation of a new possibility for our life, the opening of a new possibility for our life, and this new possibility is at the point of something which was impossible, the revelation of a potentiality of our subjectivity, which was absolutely obscure or impossible. So the event of the encounter for love, the future of which is love, the event of the encounter is really a new relationship to our proper being, as being able of something which is really a new possibility of life. And so it's a mediation. Love is a mediation. The encounter is a mediation between our existence and our being. Which is why also it is something terrible. Not always terrible. Why? Because there is something terrible when we find a new access to the infinite. It's not something which is quiet and so on. It's something hard, something terrible. Why? Because it's really a new opening to our being. And so it's a birth in ourselves, the birth of a new subject. Finally, Romanticism can be defined that the possibility for individual to become a new subject. And that was absolutely absent to the purely classical vision, where the good is to realize our potentialities and not to create or to become a new subject. So the difference between the classical vision, which is a realization of ourselves, becomes in Romanticism the creation of a new subject. And in any case, it's two different forms of relationship between finite and the infinite. In the first case, we must realize our finite possibilities. And the second case, we must open an access to the infinite possibilities of the new subject. And so, when the third sequence begins, in fact, during many centuries, with a mixture between the first and the second, when the third sequence begins, we are inside the two possibilities, classical vision or romanticism. So the dialectic of the third sequence, and we are, it's the law today, the dialectics of the third sequence is naturally the dialectics between classicism and romanticism. Between classicism and romanticism with something which is neither one nor the other, naturally, which is the modern form of subjectivity. And maybe this form is not completely created today, and that is our problem. But we examine the third sequence